Morning, everybody.
Morning.
John, I can't hear.
I can hear you.
They don't seem to hear me.
What is that now?
Are you sure about that? Because they also, don't forget, things are on mute at the moment.
Oh, okay. All right.
So, Mr. Linnell was saying he couldn't hear us.
There you go.
I can hear you now, Council.
He can hear now.
Yes, those things should be checked before I come in.
Indeed, sir. Yeah.
Are we ready?
We are ready, Chairperson.
Yes, okay, let's get going. Mr. Linnell, the oath you took yesterday continues to apply today. You understand that?
I understand that, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Yeah.
I know that when we lost the signal, I had asked you a certain question, and I asked you not to forget the question and your answer, and you promised not to forget the question and the answer. Do you still remember the question and the answer?
I do indeed, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, all right. I can't remember what the question was. Obviously, I don't know what the answer was going to be.
I'll follow on from that as you asked me to do. Mr. Chairman, yesterday you asked a specific question because I had made a statement, a general statement, that state-owned enterprises and other state entities lack the internal capacity or capability to interrupt and prevent corruption. So you queried that on the basis that these entities all have capable human resource and legal departments within them, and then therefore should not necessarily need external.
Yeah. It seems we lost this.
We have lost him.
Yes. Okay, he's still talking, but we can't hear him. We can't hear you, Mr. Nick. Maybe you can hear us, but we...
Do I need to adjourn?
No,
Oh, there.
Or is he coming back?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, so you queried why was it not that internal companies with HR departments and legal departments had the capacity to do this? And
yes, yes. I'm sorry, Mr. Linnell. You have helped me remember what my question was, but I think you may have understood it in a different way than I intended it. I think you had said that you had assisted SAA to deal with a disciplinary matter or disciplinary hearing relating to somebody at SAA, and I had questioned why Mr. Dumienu would bring you in to deal with that, because an entity such as SAA would have a legal department and would have a human resources department that could deal with disciplinary matters. I think that was my question, and you were going to give your answer, because I think you said that SAA did not have either did not have a legal department or did not have people who could do what you were doing.
Mr. Chairman, that's, as I understood your question to be, my
Yes.
answer to that is that If it were true that these state-owned enterprises, including South African Airways and Eskom and others, did have the capacity to do as you would expect, then you would not be here for the last 200 days listening daily to state-owned enterprises that had failed to detect and prevent corruption. Every single one had an internal HR and legal department. And every single day brought before you are instances of how that failed. And South African Airways is no exception. In the case of South African Airways, where I performed a coordinating role, it provided an external influence to the investigation, and it allowed a light to be shone on that investigation, which the internal functionaries were dispossessed of that power, simply because of the environment in which state-owned enterprises and other state entities are obliged to operate, even to this day. So my comment, sir, was to make it clear that the role of an external coordinator who had the liberty to detect what was wrong, to highlight it and expose it, was a positive influence and value to these entities. And when I come before you with my affidavit, which the Commission has, in respect of SAA, I would hope to explain my role there. Obviously today, as we go through my role as a coordinator at Eskom, I hope to be able to provide you with that explanation of what my conduct was at SAA, in fact, and the fact that other entities might have had an agenda, why they might have interposed my role. I would ask to have that divorced from what I did, because what I did is what I did. Their motive, they must come before you and explain directly, but I did not conduct their motive. I conducted my role, which I hope to put to you today, sir.
No. I understand what you are saying, Mr. Linnell, but I think your answer is wider than my question, or maybe addresses a slightly different issue. You talk about corruption in general. I was talking about, to the extent that you were brought in to deal with disciplinary matters, to the extent that you were brought in to deal with disciplinary matters. So my question was, my understanding would be that these SOEs would have people who can run disciplinary hearings, and I do know that sometimes they would bring in lawyers from outside. But it seems to me, and you must tell me if I misunderstand what you have said, it seems to me that in relation to disciplinary matters, at least the one at SAA, if I understood you correctly, SAA would have a situation where they bring you in regard to a disciplinary matter, and they might still need to bring lawyers as well. So if I am right that they would have internal people who can deal with disciplinary matters, it would seem therefore that they leave people within the department, within the entity, who can deal with disciplinary matters. And disciplinary matters don't really need lawyers, because disciplinary matters are not supposed to be run like trials in courts. They would have internal people, and then they bring you in, then lawyers are brought in. It just seems to me that you in that situation, you are bound to end up with the entity paying a lot of money for outside people on a matter that could be dealt with internally. So that's what I'm talking about, and I'm confining it to a disciplinary hearing purposefully, because it's easier to deal with that than to talk about general. We can talk about general later on, but just confining oneself to a situation where you were brought in to deal with a disciplinary matter in, for example, SAA. That's my concern. You understand?
Mr. Chairman, if I could, I do, sir. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, disciplinary procedure is an end result of an allegation, an investigation, which, if has merit, leads to a disciplinary hearing. The first step is an allegation and an investigation. In most SOEs, many of the functionaries who are associated with the wrongdoing are the people at the top of the organization. Not exclusively, but in many cases they are. It is impossible for people who are subordinate to those leaders in that environment to have the independent capability to inquire and investigate their bosses. It does not happen. In real life, sir, it cannot happen. It is unfair on those people to challenge their bosses and get to a point where they suggest their bosses be subject to a disciplinary hearing. I didn't get involved in the many disciplinary hearings which HR and legal do every day in those organizations. Typically, there were people who are at the heads of their organization, and it is unfair and unreasonable for someone internal to that to try and discipline or expose his boss. And I think, sir, even listening to many of the people who deposed before you during this commission have expressed that limited ability. And I think, sir, I've heard you express consternation that that was not possible and it ought to happen. So at SAA, sir, the investigations and coordination I was involved with, and always with professional people alongside me, was simply to make sure that the people at the top for whom allegations had been made were thoroughly investigated, exposed, and dealt with. And so many times that exposure led to them being acquitted. So there was a transparent investigation, but it led to them being exonerated. And that is also right, and it is also fair and just. So it is not just the people who are found to have behaved incorrectly. It is as important to be found to be independently exonerated. And that was my role, sir.
Yes.
And I think today, hopefully, that would be depicted in Eskom as well.
Yes. No, you see, to the extent that you talk about top people like the CEO, the CFO, I think one would understand the idea of bringing somebody from outside, you know. But there may be a lot of managers who can be dealt with internally. So I think that it would be a question of looking at a particular entity and looking at the level of the position that a particular employee or manager holds. If there are people within the entity who can handle that disciplinary matter in relation to that person, because there are people above him or her who can deal with the matter, then that should be dealt with that way. But once I accept that once you reach a certain level, the CEO, the CFO, you might need somebody from outside. But even there, my query would be, if you are going to need attorneys, why do you need a coordinator, you know? I know, for example, with regard to SAA, that there was a matter which has been testified about before this commission, where a law firm was brought in, and the law firm provided what is called an initiator, like a prosecutor, if you like, in the disciplinary inquiry. Then they brought in an advocate to chair the disciplinary inquiry, you know. So there are those things. So I would imagine that to the extent that an entity does that, that should be enough. Do you want to say something about that? Obviously, I'm not speaking about a specific case. I'm speaking in general. Do you want to say something about that?
I think you said two things, Mr. Chairman. One is that at the lower levels, the internal capacity should be enough to deal with those, because those would be typically free of influence because they are normal. And I would agree with you totally. And you then said that the people at the higher levels might warrant an external person in the form of an advocate or an attorney to come and provide some sort of independence. And I agree with that. But in a big matter, and possibly, sir, the better way of me explaining the role of a coordinator who provides a value would be heard in the evidence which will be brought before you today of what my role was or intended to be at Eskom, because the proper coordinator understands that in complicated cases, even an independent investigator acquires a perception and a direction where they follow. And it is not untoward, it is not unreasonable to have someone else who points out and says, does this necessarily lead in this way, or should we also expose that? And I think in the Eskom papers, that will be demonstrated in a factual way. But so in the SAA ones, when you've had my statements for a couple of years, not you personally or your commission has, in each of the instances that I have been involved there would have been largely similar to what you will hear today. But when I come before you in those instances, I could then be able to deal with those facts as facts in those instances.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you, Mr. Selega.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Linnell, we know that in respect of Eskom, there were no disciplinary proceedings instituted against the executives that got suspended.
Mr. Chairman, there was, to the point that I left Eskom the week of the, say, 19th, the executives had been suspended on precautionary suspension, as we discussed yesterday, with a view to ensuring that the investigation was free of their influence. Subsequent to my removal, those executives, or some of them, were terminated for want of a better reason, but to my knowledge, no disciplinary hearings or allegations were ever made against those people.
Yes, but you would have known that that was clear from the very beginning, that no wrongdoing was being alleged against them or any issue of misconduct. So that was apparent from the very beginning.
If I could put it, Mr. Chairman, I could answer it this way. Certainly there were allegations about a host of things within Eskom which we now know to be true. But at that time there were allegations. Some of those pointed to departments which it was meant to be the three executives headed those departments. And in some cases, subsequent revelations have indicated those people were involved. So at that time, sir, I was aware, and I think in the recordings of the board meetings, I did indicate that the investigation could well identify wrongdoing on the part of these people, but at that time, there should be no preposition that anything was alleged or considered against them. It was purely precautionary.
Yes, but what I'm saying to you, Mr. Linnell, is what the board decided. The board decided we will not make any allegations of wrongdoing against them. These people are not being suspended for misconduct. Correct?
That is correct.
Yes.
And I agree with that, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. So
I
that's...
agree with that.
Yes, thank you. So yesterday we went through, and you know, just before I move on, that is evident also from your statement. I want to read that statement we were dealing with, the supplementary statement, on page 26.3, top left-hand corner, 26.3.
Is that the supplementary, Mr. Chairman?
That is the supplementary, yes, the supplementary affidavit. It starts on page 26.1.
If you could read it, Council, I recollect it.
You recollect. It's on page 26.3, paragraph 15.4. It says, you read, while there was unverified information that the three might have had previously been perceived to impede an investigation of their areas of responsibility, it was made clear that no direct aspersions or allegations were intended or contemplated at that stage. That was the task of the investigation. The executives were, as I understand, individually counseled regarding that point, and this was publicly stated to staff and through the media. The suspensions were precautionary to allow the investigation to proceed quickly and free from any perceived influence, while acknowledging that if wrongdoing was found, then some accountability rests with top management. So my emphasis is on it was made clear that no direct aspersions or allegations were intended or contemplated against the executives.
I stand by that statement, correct,
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Linnell, we have gone through the version that is put by Ms. Dudumieni in her affidavit yesterday. And the chairperson also asked you the question about, well, expressing this particular point, that it may well be good to have concerns about what is happening in an SOE. It's well and good. But the question is, and it's another matter, how do you express those concerns and how do you go about dealing with them? You recall that?
I do.
Yes. Now, let's see what is happening here. Because as we were going through the statement of Ms. Mieni yesterday, you could see that the type of meetings that were held with you and where they were held, at times they were held, have become an issue before this commission. You appreciate that?
I appreciate that.
Yeah. You see that coming out of those meetings, we have had completely conflicting versions about what transpired in those meetings. You hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes, but
Do you want me to comment?
it's a yes or no. We have gone through the evidence yesterday,
Yes.
and we see one version from Ms. Mieni, a different version from yourself. You can speak out.
Okay. You're correct, Mr. Chairman, that there were different versions. I think the version of Mr. Tsotsi and my version is by and large similar.
Yes.
The version of Ms. Mieni is entirely different. That the documentation which immediately followed that meeting confirms the call it my version and the Tsotsi version by and large.
Yes.
The documents documented that same evening on the 8th, in a sense, were a version of the minute because it agreed a process.
Yes. And let's take the point further, Mr. Linnell, because we're dealing here specifically with how do you address the concerns? What steps are proper to address those concerns? Look at the meetings that you have. Look at the persons who are present in those meetings. The meeting which is particularly held on Sunday, these meetings are not at Eskom. You follow?
I do.
This meeting is not with the board at Eskom.
I agree.
You agree? And what you see out of this meeting is Ms. Mieni disavowing even the involvement of the president in the meeting.
I do. I understand that.
And that is exactly the concern the chairperson is trying to raise with you. You may have concerns about what's happening, but how do you go about dealing with those concerns? You need a proper way. Ms. Miani herself in her affidavit says, the president could never have been part of this meeting. He could never have given instructions in the manner in which Mr. Tsotsi says the president did. And I quickly want to read from her statement. She says, at the level of the former president, one would expect a written directive to the minister of, or chairman of the board.
Mr. Selega, I'm not sure Mr. Linnell can help much on that. He was invited to a meeting. He agreed to come to a meeting. He was told what the venue was. He went to the venue, participated, and as long as he was asked to be involved, he continued to be involved until he was told he was no longer required. So I'm not sure that he can help much in terms of that. Of course, if you ask him a direct question whether if you raise or you make a proposition of what was wrong with this meeting or with this way of handling things, then he can comment if he's able to.
Thank you, Mr. Linnell. You've heard the chairperson. Let me put to you what I'm seeking to raise with you, which is the manner in which the matter was dealt with, the manner in which meetings were held, issues discussed, and decided to be carried out, not raise a concern to you as a former magistrate, as a lawyer, with, you know, in your experience as a lawyer. So,
Mr. Chairman, In my
Or maybe,
perception and understanding-
I'm sorry, Mr. Linnell. Let me ask the question this way, and if you are not covered by the answer afterwards, you can put it in another way. Mr. Linnell, when you look at this meeting in Durban, when you look at who was present at the meeting, what was being discussed, and that it was about Eskom, is there any concern you have about the meeting and the discussions and the composition of the meeting and the venue, everything? Was there anything that concerned you about the meeting?
I think the simple answer, Mr. Chairman, is no, I was not concerned. But the reason I'm not concerned is more important than that. I have no doubt in this real world that meetings of government and state do not take place in every instance, even to this day, in a formal environment. Interactions take place, and that is how the world works. It happens in business, it happens in the state. And if that was the then president's preferred modus operandi, as long as he was doing it for proper purpose, then there was nothing wrong with it. I would think we could cite hundreds of examples where presidents meet third parties because they want to facilitate the improvement of the state. And there's nothing wrong with that. So it is not untoward in my view. I agree that if the motive is improper, then the whole thing is improper. But the important thing was the execution of that intention should be done properly.
I guess what you are saying.
Your intention.
I guess what you are saying is, in principle, there is nothing wrong with a president of the country asking people that he wants to meet to come to his residence for a meeting. That's the one thing you are saying. Is that correct?
I'm saying that, yes, in the context of state business,
Yes.
there's nothing wrong with him conducting
Yes.
his state affairs the way he thinks best.
Yes, yes. And with regard to the composition of the meeting, you are saying you would leave that to the president as to who he wants to have in a particular meeting. Am I right that that's what you are saying?
I would be saying that as well, yes.
Yes, yes. Okay, all right. Mr. Siller?
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you, Mr. Linnell. So let me move on to this point, Mr. Linnell, regarding the role of a coordinator, because that also has to do with the manner in which this process unfolded. And as I go into it, may I ask you this? I seem to understand from what you have explained to the chairperson that you are saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the end justifies the means.
I would not go so far as to say that as a broad statement. I think certainly the means are important. The means have to be proper and appropriate and lawful. So I'm not saying one can do anything. For example, I think as an example is superfluous. My answer is, I think the process is important as much as the end.
Okay. Now, let's look at your position, because you are asked to be the coordinator of an investigation or an inquiry.
Correct.
Was there a formal appointment for you?
I think in simple terms, or the formality of that, there was no formal appointment. I sat at a board meeting in which the resolution adopted was that I conduct certain subsequent steps. The board was present, and I think that was largely documented, not disputed. If one said was I appointed to run and coordinate the whole investigation, that had not arisen because the preconditions to the approval of this, which was in my board memorandum, included, for example, the approval of the Ministry of Finance and others, etc.
No.
So they had got to base one.
Okay, there was...
I've been appointed to do it.
Yes, sorry. So your answer to the chairperson is there was no formal appointment for you to serve as a coordinator.
I guess when you say formal appointment, you mean a written appointment, a letter of appointment. Yeah.
By Eskom, by the board.
I think the answer is yes. Yes.
There was no
A written letter of appointment.
correct, Kevin.
Yeah.
There's no letter of appointment.
Yeah. And we see from your affidavit, Mr. Linnell, that you would have started with the work of drafting resolutions, drafting a memorandum, drafting letters of suspension, even before you met with the board.
Correct.
I think, Mr. Slugger, it's important, once we have moved away from the Durban meeting,
Yes, Chair.
that we deal quickly with what he did after the Durban meeting, but before the meeting of the 11th. There are, I think, memos and emails that we cover that. Then we come to the meeting of the 11th. But if I'm derailing you, feel free to follow to your plan. But I would like that sequence to say, we dealt with how he was called to Pretoria by Ms. Mieni. We dealt with the meeting in Pretoria. We dealt with the meeting in Durban. We need to deal with what happened after the meeting in Durban, but before the 11th. Then we come to the 11th, and then there'll be a time to say between the 11th and the 19th or 20th, what was his involvement and what happened.
Yes.
It's going to be easier, certainly to me, if we deal with it in that sequence.
That's also an appropriate order, Chairperson.
Yeah.
Mr. Linnell, I was running ahead of the chairperson there. So, Mr. Linnell, let's take it step by step then. Coming out of the meeting on Sunday, you say you would have left the presidency at around 4 in the late afternoon.
That is,
Yes. Then could you please relate to the chairperson what was given to you as a task relative to the intended inquiry for you to do?
the agreement, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The agreement leaving that meeting, the understanding was that I would prepare a board memorandum together with supporting resolutions which would be submitted by Mr. Tsotsi that evening to members of the board, which would propose to them an extraordinary board meeting the following day, being the Monday, the 9th, to discuss the contents of the memorandum, which were a proposal that an inquiry be conducted into the affairs of Eskom. That at that point was agreed. Then, I think implicit in that agreement, but not immediately following that evening's requirement was that I would prepare a draft aid memoir which would be used to support the board in conducting the pre-suspension hearings with the individuals concerned. So the following day, on the Monday, or maybe overnight or whatever, the next day, I had prepared a memorandum which is before us in the pack, together with a suggested suspension letter. The memorandum included the various steps on how to conduct a preliminary hearing towards precautionary suspension. And then I sent that to a large legal firm. I asked them to vet that memorandum and proposal and the suspension letters. And I asked them specifically to determine 3 or 4 points which are in the letter in the pack, including, is this right, is this proper, is this lawful, and is there anything else which might or might not be right or wrong with it. Subsequent to that, that was done, and that document was also forwarded to Mr Tsotsi at SAA, and those same lawyers attended the meeting, I think on the 9th, at Eskom, but were never called in because the meeting aborted the discussion. But they would have been there themselves to discuss the legality of pre-suspensions. But that was the limit at that point of what I was instructed to do.
Yes, thank you. So that, if you go to your affidavit, if you would, Mr. Linnell, on page 33, page 33 from paragraph 24, as you go there, it says that evening, and I believe you're referring to the evening of the Sunday, the 8th of March, 2015.
Yes, I'm there, Mr. Chairman.
Are you there? The evening is of the 8th of March 2015.
Correct. Would you like me to read that?
No, I'll read it quickly. That evening I drafted a proposed board memorandum and proposed resolutions and forwarded these to Mr. Tsotsi. The email also provided process guidance notes for Mr. Tsotsi for the board meeting. This note emphasized the need to inform the board of the president's role and the key requirements of the proposed inquiry. In the next paragraph, which is 25, it says, between Monday 9 March and 11 March, I took formal legal advice on the proposed suspensions. This included the opinion that the proposed suspensions were not inconsistent with Eskom disciplinary code or prevailing case law. 26, I prepared an aid memoir detailing the process of the suspension, discussions together with the draft suspension letter, which were reviewed, amended, and finalized by the senior labor attorney, consulted, and these were forwarded in writing to Mr. Tsotsi on the 11th of March. And then you say you went to Megawatt Park in anticipation of being called by the board. You took with you a senior labor lawyer, consulted, and his associate to deal with labor matters if requested by the board. We were, however, later told that the board was not in agreement, and we left. In part, I considered that that might be the end of the matter. So which date, well, is this what you are referring to in your explanation to the chairperson?
It is, Mr. Chairman. One point that which is correct here or needs clarification, paragraph 27, when we went to Megawatt Park with the attorneys, I think that was on the 9th, whereas as the sequence as you read it, it's almost as if it might have been on the 11th. They attended the first aborted meeting, or they were downstairs on the 9th. So at that stage, the formal documentation that you've read about and we refer to as annexures, I didn't think they would have been completed at that point. So the lawyers went before the documents had been done,
Yes.
in case they were asked to give a verbal opinion.
Did you attend the meeting of the 9th of March of the Eskom board?
No, we remained downstairs until we were told it had been cancelled.
Does that mean you were on standby for that meeting if you were needed at the meeting?
Correct, Mr. Chairman. We were asked by Mr. Tutsi, well, he didn't ask me to bring the attorneys. He asked me to be there I think in the morning of the 9th to appear before the board. I asked the attorneys to go with me because it was going to require some form of legal assistance. We sat downstairs in the reception area until about midday, at which stage we were told there was not going to be an occasion to meet them, and we all left.
Mr. Selega, have we identified all the documents he prepared and forwarded
Yes.
to Mr. Tsotsi
The,
after the Durban meeting, but before the meeting of the 11th?
we haven't gone into them yet, Chairperson.
Oh,
We
okay.
could do so now.
Okay.
We
all
do
right.
so. I just have one question to ask him before we do so. Mr. Linnell, you were in Durban Sunday evening on the 8th of March. This meeting on the 9th of March is the next day, and we understand that it was scheduled to take place at 9 o'clock. Did you come to Joburg directly from Durban?
I did, Mr. Chairman. I believe I flew out on the first flight on the Monday morning, the 9th.
Yeah. I think the chairperson was asking about that in relation to another meeting, so it related to this meeting. Now, let's look at the annexures that you referred to. Let's go back to paragraph 24 of your affidavit, page 33, where you say you drafted a proposed board memorandum, proposed resolutions, and forwarded these to Mr. Tsotsi. This note emphasized, there's a guidance note as well, it emphasized the need to inform the board of the president's role. And you refer us to page 15, that would be page 43 of the bundle.
43.
Yes.
That is correct. That is the letter I sent to Mr. Tsotsi on the morning, the evening of the 8th.
What was the gist of what you were saying in that email/stroke letter?
Mr. Chairman, it had two annexes. One was a memorandum to the board calling for a special meeting of the board at short notice, and included some narrative about the formalities of that, and it included the proposed resolutions that the board would have wanted to consider if they agreed to that memorandum. So they were attached, and then the letter is more incisive than that because it did a number of things. It suggested that the company secretary adapt these documents to meet the standards of the company. So I was providing content, and I was asking that the company secretary address it in the terms of as Eskom requires them. And I then provided some guidelines as the importance of how to get people to the meeting. And then coming back to Council's earliest question this morning about the discrepancy of an unrecorded or unminuted meeting in Durban on the 8th. In this document, which we're looking at now, towards the bottom, it makes it quite clear. The board has engaged both you as chairman and the minister regarding the current status of Eskom. It is his view that the effect of the economy, he believes that the board is obliged to address the weaknesses and challenges facing the company. In order to do that, the board must be certain that it has accurate facts on hand. Once that it has these facts, it should act decisively and with conviction. Then it goes on, it says in paragraph 4 there, you have also had a conversation with the minister who has concurred with the initiative as proposed by the president and formulated by yourself. So the nexus of that, Mr. Chairman, is that it is made quite clear in those earliest documents of the 8th that this directive originates from the presidency.
Yeah.
And it requires the involvement of the minister.
Yes.
Yes, I see that in the second half of the letter stroke email at page 43, you say to Mr. Tsotsi, once you get the green light, please call each director, providing them with context. 1, the president has engaged both you as chairman and the minister regarding the current status of Eskom. It is his view that the effect on the economy is massively understated. Were you basing that on the Durban meeting, on what was said at the Durban meeting?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman, and it probably needs qualification. That was not in so many words, his words, but that was the assent to the words that were proposed to him in that second session. So the discussion included this, which he assented to. So his assent to what was discussed is this, as opposed to this being his wording.
Yes. Okay, Mr. Silega.
Thank you, Chair. Just for the purpose of the record, Mr. Linnell, I will identify the email. It's an email from yourself, sent on Sunday, 8 March. Thank you. Sunday, 8 March 2015 at 6:37 p.m. is sent to ztsotsi@liquefier.biz, and the subject line is Board Memorandum and Resolutions, 9 March 2015. You say, Dear Chair, please find a copy of the memorandum and proposed resolutions. If you are happy, I would suggest that you require the company secretary to adapt to any format standards used by Eskom. So you've said that already to the chairperson. Could you also review the substance of this to ensure that you feel it makes the point adequately? This document would be circulated together with a notice of an urgent meeting for the board to attend at 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. bracket if you believe it will give members more time to attend, close bracket. It is critical that the company secretary communicates this notice both in email and verbally, confirming that he has delivered the notice to each director. At the meeting, it will be important to record the directors who are not present, whether they received the notice. We need to have at least 7 members present. All that is apparent from this email.
Correct, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, and then that portion which the chairperson was reading out to you, which says, once you get the green light, please call each director, providing them with context. The president has engaged both you as chairman and the minister regarding the current status of Eskom. Did you know that the minister was also engaged?
The agreement that we left the presidency had an obligation upon him, and I say that with respect, and an obligation on Mr. Tsotsi. The president agreed that he would there and then consult with the minister and obtain her approval. So my expectation was by the time this was done, that had been done.
Okay, but at that stage, you didn't know for sure that the minister had been consulted.
I did not.
You wrote that in the expectation that by the time of the meeting of the board, that would have happened.
Correct, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Paragraph 2 then reads, he believes that the board, you are referring to the president there, I suppose. He believes that the board is obliged to address the weaknesses and challenges facing the company. In order to do that, the board must be certain that it has the accurately facts to hand. Once it has these facts, it should act decisively and with conviction. The current manner in which this crisis is managed is untenable. An independent inquiry is possibly the best approach, as that has the capacity to act urgently and potentially has an independent and objective approach. It will also be seen to be more transparent. Is this your own words? I mean, concepts, or are these concepts that were used by the president? An independent inquiry, it should be more transparent, it should be urgent and have an objective approach.
My paraphrasing of the understanding of the meeting, with respect, Mr. Chairman, yesterday I think we looked at the part of the meeting in my affidavit where we concluded this, we read them into the record, there were 4 or 5 agreements at the meeting with the presidency. I believe this summed up those points.
Basically, what you were doing here in this email, you were seeking to guide the chairperson, Mr. Tsotsi, as to how to handle this issue with regard to at the board meeting, and you were basing that on your understanding of what the Durban meeting contemplated. Is that right?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you. That's right. I'll just read this one paragraph, Mr. Linnell. It says, paragraph 4, you have also had a conversation with the minister who has concurred with the initiative proposed by the president and formulated by yourself and the approach proposed. I will ask you again a similar question in respect of the first paragraph. Did you know that Mr. Tsotsi had had a conversation with the minister?
Didn't you ask him already that question? I think you did.
That relates to the president, to the first one, Chair.
Oh, I thought there was specifically the one relating to paragraph 4, which only refers to the minister.
Paragraph 1 also refers to the minister, Chair.
Okay. Mr. Linnell, I thought he had asked you that question, but if he hasn't, you can answer, but I know what the answer is.
I think it is a different question. So at that stage when I said Mr. Tsotsi has spoken to the minister, that was me writing as it would be at 9 o'clock or later that evening, because he was going to have a conversation with the minister. So it was recording what he would be saying, that he had had a conversation with the minister. That is Mr. Tsotsi's conversation with the minister rather than the president, separate conversation with the minister.
Well, we may have spoken at cross purposes, but when earlier on you read paragraph 4, I came in and said what you were writing under 4 was what you expected would have happened by the time of the meeting. So we might have spoken at cross purposes, but I was talking about the minister. That's why I was saying I thought the question had been asked. Okay, all right.
Chairperson, if you look at paragraph... Sorry.
That is correct.
Chairperson, if you look at paragraph 1,
Yeah.
it also has the minister. The president has engaged both you as chairman and the minister. So my first question related to that.
Well, I certainly was looking at paragraph 4, not 1. But paragraph 1, my paragraph 1 says the president has engaged both you as chairman and the minister in a small letter. You see,
That's right.
under D, the minister is capital letter, so it's easy to see it. Yes, okay, all right.
Yeah, because the first one says it's the president who engages the minister.
Okay. Well, I spoke thinking we were talking about 4, but that's fine.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you. So, Mr. Linnell, these were then the documents exchanged with Mr. Tsotsi prior to the meeting of the 9th of March.
I think sent rather than exchanged.
That is correct.
Sent to him.
Yes.
Because Mr. Tsotsi didn't send anything, did he?
Oh, he also did.
He did. Oh, okay.
Yeah, we did go through those emails.
Oh, okay, all right. So it's documents that were exchanged.
Yes. Mr. Linnell?
You confirm that, Mr. Linnell? You confirm that these are documents?
I certainly sent it to him, I think, at 6:30 on Sunday night, the 8th.
Yeah.
Possible that there was further communication, I think, between him and me subsequent to this. There were back and forth emails on the same topic that evening.
Yes.
So I think this was part of a dialogue by email with Mr. Tsotsi that evening.
Yes.
Yes.
And you confirm the contents of the memorandum appearing at page 45. That is the memorandum, one of the memoranda.
Yes.
You confirm the contents thereof, is that right?
I confirm the contents thereof of that email.
Yes. Is there anything you want to highlight in that memorandum, or we can take it as read? You were simply giving guidance.
Bear with me, Mr. Chairman.
You were giving guidance.
Chairman, there's one. There's nothing extra to.
Nothing you want to highlight.
Unless there's something you want me to refer to specifically,
Yes.
it reads for itself.
Yes, but it speaks for itself.
Elaborate.
Mr. Seleka, if there's something you want him to highlight, I don't think it's necessary. The memo speaks for itself.
Correct.
Then at page 47, you have got a decision record of the board. You prepared that to assist Mr. Tsotsi in the meeting in terms of what the board would need to resolve. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. And the briefing notes at page 51, what was the purpose of those briefing notes? Was that to guide the chairperson in carrying out the suspension of the directors, of the executives?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, what was the page?
Page 51. 51.
51.
Yes. It says briefing notes for pre-suspension hearing. Sorry?
Yes. Mr. Chairman, these, from 51 following that, I developed that, I think, between maybe that evening or the Monday, the 9th through to I think the 11th. At the 11th, these were signed off by the external attorneys who reviewed this. And this document was the one ultimately that I forwarded, I think, on the morning, I stand corrected, it's in the record, on the morning of the 11th in advance of that board meeting. So this was a briefing note in detail as to how to go about it properly, and the proposed suspension letters. And if I might, Mr. Chairman, I don't think I mentioned it to council, but the suspension letters here are not ultimately the suspension letters which Mr. Matona was required to sign. And
Yes, before, yes.
Had a subsequent CCMA matter.
Yes, before we get there, let's just finish. Hang on, Mr. Linnell.
Not follow that.
Hang on, Mr. Linnell. Let's finish with regard to the briefing notes before we get to the suspension letters. What was the purpose of the briefing notes? Was it to guide the chairperson in handling the suspension of the executives?
Yes, it was, Mr. Chairman.
It sought to give him a step-by-step guide as to what to do. Is that right?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman. My sense was, if you're going to do this and we don't do it properly, it will be upended on day one. And this stressed the importance of doing it procedurally correctly.
Yes, and I see that as at this stage, in terms of these notes, it seems you were talking about the suspension of only 3 executives. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
At that stage, you had no knowledge of a 4th executive who was going to be suspended.
Not to my recollection. My recollection is that the 4th name was certainly discussed, but I think it was during the board meeting or the Audit and Risk Committee board meeting on the 11th.
Yes.
But when I drafted this, my recollection, there were only 3 people who had been identified.
Yes.
But
Okay.
certainly I remember later there was a discussion about the 4th.
Okay, all right, Mr. Selega. I'm happy up to that point, unless there are some specific questions you want him to deal with in regard to those notes.
No, Chair. That's the issues are apparent from
Yeah. He wanted to say something about the suspension letters. Do you want to ask him about that?
Yes. Mr. Linnell, you were trying to explain to the chairperson whether this suspension, well, sorry, let's go to page 55. Let's go to page 55 of the bundle. We see draft, what appears to be draft letters of suspension.
Correct, these are.
Would this have been drafted by you as well?
I drafted these, but I had the firm of attorneys to review them. They made certain corrections to them, which were incorporated in this version you have here.
And what did you want to say to the chairperson about this letter of suspension?
Probably at the wrong sequence, but Mr. Chairman, Council, you might come to it later. Mr. Chairman, as I understand it later, when the CCMA hearing was heard, I looked at the discourse on that, and I think this process and the suspension letter was not followed in at least one of the instances when the suspensions took place. So the purpose of this, to some extent, not rolled out as intended.
Okay.
Yeah. Should we understand you to be saying the suspension letter you drafted was not the one ultimately used in the suspension itself?
I believe when I checked, and I stand corrected, there were changes made to the letters, which I think in the CCMA, together with the discussions, rendered them procedurally unfair.
Okay. So, going to the meeting of the 9th, you say you were not called into the meeting. You were invited, but you didn't get to go into the meeting because you were advised that the board doesn't agree with the proposal.
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Can you tell the chairperson what happens thereafter in regard to your services in particular?
I think at that point when we left, my perception was this had come to the end. But I think whether it was later that afternoon or the next day, Mr. Tsotsi invited me to come back on the 11th. So to the extent that on the 9th it was dead, by the 10th or 11th, I had been re-invited to attend a meeting on the 11th.
So the 11th of March 2015 was a Wednesday.
I believe so, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Sunday is the 8th, and you have a meeting on the 9th, the next day, the board, not yourself, which was a Monday. Tuesday is the 10th, and the 11th is a Wednesday. Did you go back to Cape Town, or you remained in Joburg?
I remained in Joburg, Mr. Chairman. I was engaged on another matter, which required me in Joburg.
Did you do any further work in relation to the intended inquiry between the 9th and the 11th?
I would imagine so. I can't recall when Mr. Tutsi said he would want me there on the 11th, but I'm quite sure between the 9th and the 11th I'd done a lot more work, including having the documents we just reviewed signed off by the firm of attorneys.
Could you tell the chairperson when did you put together the terms of reference for the intended inquiry?
I would have Mr. Chairman, I would have started that process in my mind, I would imagine, after the 11th.
Okay.
Then there was no time period in which to do it, although it was urgent. So it might have been piecemeal, but on the 15th of March, which would have been the Sunday following, I got an email from, I think, the company secretary, it's one of the annexures, asking me for my comment on their version of the terms of reference.
Okay.
At that point, I
We will come to it.
drafted theirs and forwarded it.
Yes, we will come to it. Chair, we need to go into the meeting of the 11th. I see the time.
Okay, well, let's just start a little bit. What was the purpose of your being asked to come to the meeting of the 11th, Mr. Linnell, as you understood it?
I think it was, Mr. Chairman, I think it was very much the same purpose as the 9th, that I would appear before the board to discuss the proposed inquiry.
Would it be correct to say the purpose was for you to effectively give support to Mr. Tsotsi as chairperson in reporting to the board about the meeting about the Durban meeting and assisting to answer questions assisting in the answering of questions that could arise from the meeting, the board meeting, with regard to the investigation or the inquiry and the suspension and all issues connected with what was discussed in Durban. Is that right?
That is correct.
And to see whether the board was approving the Durban decisions, so to speak. Is that right?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
And the Durban decisions included that, one, there should be an inquiry into the affairs of Eskom. Two, that inquiry should not take more than 3 months. Three, that inquiry should be conducted transparently. Four, that inquiry should be independent. Five, you should be the coordinator of that inquiry. And six, the three executives should be suspended pending the completion of that inquiry. Those were some of the important issues that needed to be placed before the board to see whether the board approved. Is that right?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Okay. Let's take the tea adjournment, and we'll resume at 11:30.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Okay.
the technicians or advisors about this laptop must talk to the technicians or advisors who were involved when I had the evidence of other witnesses via video link, because the witnesses could see me without a laptop here. So I've had a number of witnesses via video link, and I don't remember that there was ever a laptop here. So, but let's continue. Okay, Mr. Slega?
Thank you, Chairperson. Mr. Linnell, you are still with us?
I'm with you. Thank you, Council.
Thank you. When we adjourned, we were about to go into the meeting of the 11th of March 2015. The chairperson had asked you to give a summary of the purpose for which you were invited into that meeting. And 5 points were highlighted to you, which I think arise also from that email you had sent to Mr. Tsotsi. Now, did you, this time around, the meeting of the 11th, were you called into the meeting?
That is correct.
So you met with the board members in the meeting?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Now, just for clarity purposes, we understand that there were 3 meetings, if not 4 even, on that day. There was a meeting of the board at 9 o'clock, which was followed by a meeting of the board with the Minister Lynn Brown at the time. Were you present in any of the 2 meetings?
I was not present in the first meeting or the meeting with Minister Brown, but I think the recollection is I attended the board meeting after that, and then one of the committee meetings after that. But the record would show if I was in that, call it the meeting after Mrs. Brown. I think there was a board meeting I attended, but it might have been a committee meeting, but I did not attend the first one or the one with Mrs. Brown.
I see. And the committee one, you would have attended the 3rd meeting on that day.
I believe so.
And you say you would have attended a meeting with the committee.
That is correct.
It would have been the P&G, the People and Governance Committee.
I think that is what it is called.
Did you also attend a meeting where the executives were suspended?
No, I did not.
So you were not present when they were given letters of suspension?
No, I was not, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, now let's look at the points for which you were invited in the meeting with the board. The chairperson read out to you or summarized to you the 5 main points. One of them included the delegating powers to a subcommittee that will execute the mandate for the inquiry. So you had a proposal which included establishing an inquiry, and coupled with that was the suspension of the executives. Can you confirm to the chairperson those 2 points which were proposed in the resolution, whether the board agreed to those?
When I attended, Mr. Chairman, I think it was very clear that they agreed to the inquiry, they agreed to the delegation of authority to a subcommittee to manage that process, and I think it was in the board board subcommittee, they approved the suspensions.
Did they approve that you be the coordinator?
Mr. Chairman, I don't recollect that in so many. I can't recall whether that was expressly referred to, but it would be in the minutes. I think I read it in the minutes that they did. But without doubt, that was the outcome of that meeting, because that subcommittee then directly engaged me to do a number of activities.
I've looked at the transcript, maybe transcripts. I believe one of them is that of the board meeting that took place after the board had met with the minister. That would be the board meeting at which you were introduced to the board members, is that correct?
That is correct.
Were you introduced by Mr. Tsotsi to the board members?
Yeah, that is correct.
Yes. And as to what your role was going to be, was it Mr. Tsotsi who explained this to the board members, or was it you who explained what your role was contemplated to be?
As I recall, Mr. Chairman, he asked me to explain that to the board. So I would have told the board what I thought the role would be, or should be.
Yes, I saw in the transcript either of that meeting or in the transcript of that meeting as well as the transcript of the P&G committee meeting that from a certain stage you became very involved in the discussions. Is my understanding correct? Both at the board
I was certainly
meeting,
involved in the discussion.
both at the board meeting as well as at the P&G committee, you appear to have been very active in the discussions. Is that correct?
That would be correct, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. I got the impression, and you must tell me if this is not correct, I got the impression that the board did not reject you, did not reject your involvement, and rather that they embraced you in terms of your role in this Eskom matter.
That is correct, Mr. Chairman, very much so.
So, to the extent that they may not have expressly approved your involvement, they certainly expressed no objection, and they certainly made use of your availability and your services and allowed you to be very active in the discussions that followed. Is that right?
That is correct.
Yes, okay. Now, at the end of the board meeting, before the P&G meeting, the board had agreed that there should be an inquiry. Is that correct? Is it correct that the board had agreed that there should be an inquiry?
Very much so, Mr. Chairman. The board approved the inquiry.
And the board approved that the inquiry should not take longer than 3 months. Is that right?
Yes, they expressly said 3 months.
And the board approved the idea that there should be a suspension of executives. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
At that stage, are you able to remember, that is now the stage of the board, before the PNG meeting, do you remember whether the board was speaking about 4 executives, which included the financial director, or whether they were speaking only about 3 executives at the end of that meeting? Or is that something you are not able to remember?
I remember the discussion was back and forwards at the one meeting I attended when that was specifically discussed. At one moment, the board or the subcommittee said there were 4, then there were 3, and then there were 4, then there were 3, and that vacillated back and forwards until there was a point in time then it was 4. So there were often times that someone would summarize, okay, there's 4, and then a minute later someone would say, aren't there 3? So the final outcome of that discussion was there were 4.
That is by the end of the board meeting, before the PNG meeting.
Mr. Chairman, the record the transcripts would show which meeting it was. I can't recall if that debate about 4 or 3 backwards and forwards took place at the committee meeting, or it was at the formal board meeting, but it was.
No,
it was one of those 2.
No, that's fine. I thought you might assist. I looked at the transcript. I think, if I'm not mistaken, by end of the board meeting, you probably are right to say somebody would speak about 3, somebody else would speak about 4. But I think certainly at the PNG meeting, there was certainly a discussion of 4, even though Mr. Tsotsi at some stage, even at the PNG meeting, might have at some stage said, no, it's 3. But in the end, the people who were suspended were 4 executives, including the financial director. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Mr. Seleka, you may continue.
Thank you, Chair. Chairperson, I will not traverse those issues. Shall I move on? Mr. Linnell, then we have from your affidavit references to your subsequent engagement by the board. Can you tell the chairperson about that in regard to how you are then engaged further by the board?
Mr. Chairman, would you like me to paraphrase it generally and then go to specific paragraphs first? Should I give an overview first?
You can paraphrase. You can paraphrase.
So, okay. So, after that meeting, the chairman, I think, of one of the board subcommittees, which is now delegated with this task, Mrs. Mabunda, took me to, I went to see the internal audit executive, and we had a meeting about how the process could unfold and to what extent internal audit could supply copies of past audit reports. Then the next day, that was the 12th, there was a media briefing at which Mr. Tsotsi and members of the board introduced the inquiry to the media, including reference in that media briefing to the role that I would play as coordinator. Then following that, I attended a meeting with the top 30 executives. The purpose, and that was with Ms. Mabunda and Dr. Naidu. And I was introduced into that meeting as the person who would coordinate and run this investigation. And I addressed those executives with the request that as those people would have knowledge of some of the matters which ought to be investigated, could they submit them anonymously or through the company legal advisor, who would then send them through to me, and they would be incorporated in the terms of reference, and that was agreed at that point. Then following that, I was invited by Dr. Naidu to attend I think there's a number of letters to describe it, but it was a recovery type committee of Eskom, which was looking at the turnaround of Eskom, and I was invited to that with the introduction to the members of that committee that this person will be coordinating the investigation, and I should take part in all their deliberations to make sure I got that input. And then I was also invited back to the subcommittee to which I would have reported to if this had continued. And both of those committees to which I had been invited to were subsequently cancelled. One was reinstated and then cancelled again. And I never met any of those committees again after that. Yeah. That summary takes the course of about a week.
Yes. That's helpful.
Yes, I was about to ask you to give us a sense of the timing of these events, Mr. Linnell, because the meeting is on the 11th, and you end, the days ended with the suspension at least of the 3 executives, but where were you at the time of the suspensions of these executives? Because we see from the minutes of P&G that the suggestion is that you may have been present in that meeting when the executives were suspended.
Mr. Chairman, I certainly in the meeting in which the suspension issues were discussed, I was vocal in that meeting, and there was a lot of discussion about propriety of doing it, how it should be done, fairness of it, the fact that they should not have preconceived ideas, there had to be a process. And that debate was quite lengthy, where we went through the importance of doing it properly. And that is recorded in a subcommittee's meetings. And at that meeting, I think there was some discussion about, towards the end of it, as I recall, the legal officer of the company redrafting or drafting the suspension letters. But after that meeting, I can't recall where I went, but I did not sit in the suspension hearings.
Yeah. There was also a talk about the formation of a media release. In the P&G meeting, did you prepare a draft media statement for Eskom as well?
I think I did prepare a draft, and I haven't got my hands on that, but certainly I participated in that meeting and what should be included in that document. I can't recall now if I had drafted something before that as a template, but I was certainly involved in the discussion about the media release.
Yeah, let me just help you recall quickly, because the transcript shows that as they were talking about who will formulate the media release and what should go into it, you then said, but I have a draft, I've put together a draft. And they say, oh, you've put together a draft. And they talk about it, but then they say, Dr. Pet Naidu, you will work with Dr. Pet Naidu to finalize the draft. You recall that?
Sorry, what did he say?
That you. Then there's a voice saying you will work with Dr. Pet Naidu to finalize the media statement.
Okay, that did not happen. I did not sit with Dr. Naidu to do their press release. To my knowledge or recollection now, I don't think they did a press release at that time in the end. I think they had a media briefing. They might have read a press release to that media briefing, but I can't recall that exactly. But I don't recall sitting with Dr. Pat Naidu to finalize it, but if he suggests I did, then I would accept that. I just don't remember that.
Well, we don't know what happened, but that's what we pick up from the transcript. Talking of the press conference, you say you were announced at that press conference as the coordinator.
That is correct.
And who from the board side was present at the press conference?
I can't remember which ones, but there were 4 or 5 of them, and it might have been that committee which was now responsible for the inquiry. It was led by Mr. Tsotsi. I think he did the discussion. I think all the members of staff were also invited to that same meeting, so it was in the auditorium. And immediately after that media briefing, I received numerous direct inquiries directed to me from media about the inquiry. So it was quite clear in the media's mind, as well as anyone else's, that I was appointed to do the coordination.
Yes. Do you have questions, Chair?
Is it correct that you can't remember exactly who or at what stage the financial director's name was included in the list of executives to be suspended? Is that right? You are unsure about
I've been in
that?
one of those meetings on the...
Yes. Do you remember who exactly introduced her name into the list?
I can't recall, but I'm sure the recordings would pick that up.
Yeah,
But it certainly went back and forwards, I think, from
for some time.
time to time. There were different people proposing it and disagreeing with it. There was one gentleman who consistently opposed it. In fact, one gentleman consistently opposed all of the suspensions.
Yes. Do you remember whether that would have been Mr. Baloyi?
It was Mr. Boloy, you're right, Mr. Chair.
Yes, okay, all right. Now, the names of the people who are going to act in the positions that would be temporarily vacated by the 4 executives, do you know at what stage those names were introduced into the discussions?
I didn't go through all the transcripts, but I do not think I was at any of those meetings where that was discussed. But I do recall being in a meeting when Mr. Khoza was announced or indicated that he would be, he was appointed to be the acting CEO. Because I got a note somewhere at that comment, that was surprising because he made a comment in response to that, which, and I still remember it because it was quite interesting. He asked, what is the difference between generation and distribution? Now,
Between between what and what?
He made a statement which indicated seeking to understand the difference between generation and distribution.
Yes.
That struck my mind at the time because that is rather key to the business. And if you are going to be appointed acting CEO, that's quite an important thing to understand. So I was present when that was said in one of the meetings.
Mr. Tsotsi testified that, as I recall, when the meeting of the board ended, before lunch, he went to lunch, and when he came back, he went to the P&G committee, whose meeting had already started. I think he said he thought it may have been running for 10 minutes before he arrived. And he said that he found the meeting of the P&G committee discussing names of people who were going to replace the executives who were to be suspended. And he said he was shocked by this because of all the people who were in that meeting who were board members or members of the committee, he was the only one who would know the people who could replace temporarily the executives. Now, to the extent that you may have attended the P&G meeting, you might recall whether he said anything like that, or is that something you can't remember?
I can't recall, but if that was recorded, then I suppose that's it. But I personally don't remember being present when that committee discussed who was going to do it, and I don't remember the sequel to that. But
yes.
My only part I remember was that, but when the appointment of the acting CEO made that comment,
yes,
I was present then because that struck me.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that soon we'll need to go to what happened during the week the week preceding, or the days preceding the 19th or 20th or thereabout of March. But before we do that, I want to talk to you about whether there was a need to suspend the executives. I've seen in the correspondence and in the minutes where you motivated why you thought that the executives should be suspended. As I understand your evidence, and I think that was the evidence of Mr. Tsotsi and Mr. Ngubane as well, and Ms. Klein, the reasons given seem to be that either they, if they were not suspended, they could interfere with the investigation, or people working under them could have felt that they were not free enough to contribute to the investigation if they were asked for information. Is my understanding of your reasons correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. Now, bearing in mind that the board said that the investigation was not into any allegations of wrongdoing on the part of the executives, why would they want to interfere with the investigation? Because they were not the accused. They would be seeking to assist in finding a solution to problems at Eskom. Why should they not have been allowed to be at Eskom, continue with their jobs while assisting the investigation in whatever way, because they were the people who were running Eskom, who would have known what decisions they took, when they took those decisions, why they took those decisions, who could say, this is what we have tried. It has failed because of this or that. And if those conducting the investigation said, have you tried this? They could say, no, we didn't try, we tried because of A, B, C, D, and engage them on possibly looking at other ways of resolving problems.
Mr. Chairman, I think there's two parts to that. My strong belief is that there is, ignoring the identity of the individuals, there's a strong human risk that if there's an investigation in areas which I control, and there might be culpability or just incompetence within that area of control, the people underneath me who have information might be intimidated by my mere presence from coming forth. And I think that business principle is well established, that is a risk which happens, including, as turned out, that in a few months after this, one of the returning executives was resuspended, and during his suspension, he was found to have been communicating with people, providing the then investigators with information. So the first point is, I think there's a high risk of people being intimidated that they might interfere. The second point you make, Mr. Chairman, is this, that in their suspension letters, they are required to be available to the company and the investigators at their request in order to provide information. So the fact that they are suspended does not mean they are excluded from providing information. It is just that one wants to situationally remove them from creating a presence which might intimidate. But they're not prohibited or discouraged from providing evidence.
There was no factual basis, was there, to say these specific executives would be likely to interfere. The idea of a suspension was just based on a general proposition without reference to the specific executives. Is that right?
Not entirely, Mr. Chairman. In the briefing notes for the suspensions, I placed in that briefing note, in respect of each of the three, not the four, the three, one issue which, if true, would indicate a propensity to interfere or not come forward with, or not disclose information which needed to be disclosed. So those were in the briefing notes that I gave. So I don't know when the suspension discussions were held, whether my aid memoir for the suspensions did disclose those to those executives. But in each instance, there was one point which said, there is this allegation that in this instance, you did not disclose this. And therefore, this might indicate a propensity for you to not be forthcoming. So, and they were invited to, in my aid memoir, they would have been invited to comment on that allegation. Whether that happened or not, I do not know.
Do you know
I
whether
put that in the document? So it was a substantive issue and a general theory that one wished to avoid.
Well, I would have thought that if the idea was to find a solution without any focus on wrongdoing, I would have thought that they should have been there, they should have continued with their job, and they should have been brought in to answer questions and to engage in discussions And obviously, if they gave information, whatever information they gave could be verified, the investigators, I take it, would have all access they needed to information at Eskom. And they would be part of the solution rather than they being excluded while a solution is being found, and yet they were the people who were running the organization.
Mr. Chairman, I don't, with respect, I would not agree with that. I think if one starts off with the premise that there were problems in Eskom, there was evidence of corruption, maladministration, there was allegations of, as we saw yesterday, of sabotage. If there is reality in those allegations, then the heads of the departments in which those allegations submit to, then either those people are incompetent, not knowing that this is happening, or they are complicit in it happening. So the moment you have a situation where there's a strong demand for an investigation because there is a problem in Eskom, as I think it is clear that there was, then one has to say those people either knew it and covered it up, or they were not competent, so they did not know it. And both of those would render them vulnerable.
You see, that was part of the issue I raised with Mr. Tsotsi or Dr. Ngubane, or both of them, about this idea that the executives were being told, don't worry, there are no allegations of wrongdoing, blah, 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 because I was saying, but if there were problems at Eskom, surely the leadership of Eskom, if there is something that has gone wrong, surely the leadership of Eskom must have something to do with it, either in terms of doing certain things intentionally or not running Eskom the way it should be run, and so on. And this idea that, don't worry, there are no allegations of wrongdoing, might have been inaccurate, because maybe it might not be misconduct as such, but it might be that you people are failing to provide proper leadership to the entity. You people are failing to identify where the problems are. You people are failing to identify the solutions that should be identified as leadership of Eskom. So at one level, there is that problem, but at another level, there is the issue of if you take them out in circumstances where you say you're not pointing fingers of them or at them, it seems to send different messages. But I think you have made your point. Is that right?
Correct, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Okay, Mr. Slega.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Linnell, the difficulty, again, the chairperson is going to have is this. One of the board members, when asked about this question, whether there was any evidence that the executives would interfere with the investigation, Ms. Klein said to the chairperson, there was no a shred of evidence. And hence the question, was there a need to suspend the executives?
Mr. Chairman, it is my opinion that there's no doubt that they ought to have been suspended, whether 4 or 3. Fourth, I don't have a view on, but the 3 key players in the main departments needed to be removed, because it was well known at the time that those areas were the areas which needed to be investigated because there were things wrong in those areas. At that time, the country was suffering massive blackouts, and as we know, a potential, load shedding, but a potential blackout was possible. Now, if we have to juxtapose the interests of three executives with the lives and the economy of the country, these are choices one has to make, and they're not easy, and they're not necessarily either right or wrong. But it's a balanced point of view, and if you want to stop the bigger danger, one has to take a view, how will I determine this properly? And our view at the time, I'm not sure about Ms. Klein's view, my firm view on the time, and I think subsequent events have supported that was a necessary step.
Well, let me add, because it's not only Mrs. Klein. You have already said to the chairperson, one board member was opposed to the suspension in general, suspensions, and that was Mr. Baloyi. You have also said to the chairperson, which is what we know, Mr. Tsotsi also testified before the chairperson, that he was opposed to the suspensions when he was at the meeting on the 8th of March with yourself, Dudu Myeni, and the president. So there's at least 3 members of the board, not outside of Eskom, of the board, serving on the board with fiduciary duties, who say either there's no evidence or that we are opposed to the suspensions. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I do. Mr. Tsotsi, as we indicated yesterday, was without doubt unhappy with the suspensions on the 8th. On the 11th, he was totally supportive of the suspension. So in that board meeting, he spoke in support of the suspensions. There's no doubt about that. Dr. Baloyi, Mr. Baloyi consistently opposed it, but I think at the end he acquiesced to it, whether it was against his judgment, but my recollection, ultimately he aligned with the majority view. As to Ms. Klein's view is, I don't remember that specific comment of hers, but my recollection is, if you take the totality of the meeting, in the end she would have been supportive of the suspension. So yes, she might have made a comment during the discussion, and as I said earlier today, that discussion was extensive and went back and forwards over a lengthy period of time. It wasn't an automatic acceptance by the board. It arose out of a lengthy discussion at which consensus was achieved at the end.
Yeah. But can I make it clear to you, because the proposition the chairperson is seeking to test with you is the need for the suspension, not whether people supported the suspensions. So Ms. Klein says there is no, she testified before the commission, not that she made a comment at the meeting. In this commission, she testified there was no shred of evidence that they would impede the inquiry. Dr. Ngubane said if they went to court, they would succeed. If you look at the grounds on which they were suspended.
Mr. Chairman, I think I read the transcript. Mr. Ngubane made that comment. If one reads to the end of all those minutes, all of them present agreed to the result. So certainly along the way, people were persuading each other one way or the other. But at the end of that meeting, there was as I recall, there were no detractors from the decision to do what was done. And that is a board meeting, and I think I made it clear in my contribution at that meeting is these are things you have to decide, and this is your decision. And I certainly was a proponent of that decision or recommendation, but they agreed to it.
Yeah. Yes, well...
Did the inquiry that was going to happen, the investigation that was going to happen, Did it require interviews with lots of employees? The inquiry that was contemplated.
The terms of reference did authorize the investigators to interview all members of staff, but it also proposed a whistleblower facility, because one's experience is that even in any situation, some of the best information arises when someone just says, I'm not prepared to be identified, but I have something to tell.
Well,
So
I was going to say to you, to the extent that there may have been concern, even if there may have been no factual basis for the concern, that some employees might not feel free to talk if the executives were not suspended. The employees could be told that they could speak to the investigators without them having to identify themselves. The investigators, I guess, would be people who didn't know them. They wouldn't have to write down or write statements. They could simply say, this is what I know, this is what I suspect is contributing to the problems, without having to sign anything and without the investigators having to know their names, isn't it? That could be done. In which case, the employees should feel free to say whatever, because they know nobody's going to know within Eskom that they are the ones who gave that information.
with respect, Mr. Chairman, I don't think that's so. If two people rob the bank and one makes an anonymous tip-off that the other one was involved, that person knows who tipped them off. So if there was a wrongdoing at Eskom and one person knew his boss had done it, and his boss also knew he'd done it, and there's a whistleblower report, then it's quite clear who told the story. So those things that is the reality of these things. I think it is born of practical experience ad nausea. I don't think this is a unique situation of Eskom. I think...
But you see, you see, Mr. Linnell, obviously you are not going to have a situation where there is 100% guarantee for anything. There is no such thing on this earth. It's a question of whether it's reasonable, whether you're taking reasonable measures, and whether it's reasonable to think that somebody is going to fear this or that if the following scenario is presented. I hear what you say, but as things stand, I still am inclined to think that there may not have really been a need, but I will hear more witnesses, and maybe by the time I hear the last witness, I will have been persuaded. But I've heard what you have to say in support of the need. Mr. Silega?
May I comment, Mr. Chairman? I think...
Yes.
May I comment?
Yes, do so.
If I may respond to that.
Yeah.
At that time, the facts were not known. At that time, one had to make a decision on what you did know. And those decisions, as I said just now, when you have two competing issues and they both have consequences, someone at the time has to take a view. And sometimes that view is subsequently deemed to be the wrong view. But you have to take a view.
Yeah.
And at that time, the view was this was the right thing. I think it had been, the principle had been supported by external legal opinion. I've just seen another bundle where subsequent legal opinion supported it. And so in the circumstances at that moment, that appeared to be the right situation. Since then, events turned out regarding these suspensions, which were never anticipated. And if that had not happened, I don't believe we would be questioning the wisdom of the suspensions now. It is only post facto that one thinks this went wrong, therefore was it the correct first step? But at the time, there was nothing to indicate that this was incorrect.
So your point is simply that, as the Commission looks at whether there was a need for suspensions or not, it must remember what was known, what you knew then, as opposed to what you may have come out after.
I think there's a totality of both, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, okay, all right. Mr. Selega?
Thank you, Chairperson.
From my side, I'm happy that we moved to that last week.
Okay.
But if you still have some things, feel free to explore them.
Yes. You see, Mr. Linnell, whether or not the executives are inside or outside of the company at the time of the investigation, if information is uncovered, now testing your two robbers of the bank, if the information is discovered, then the executives would know if I acted with somebody within Eskom, that can only be that person who told the investigators what the information is, whether they are inside or outside.
That is true, and that's my point, Mr. Chairman. It is during the investigation you want someone to come forward. If I come forward with information and you are found guilty after that and you're removed and I have no risk, then I'm free to give you the information. But if you're sitting there and at that time I say, if I come forward with information, you might penalize or affect the future of my career, I'm going to take the option, and it's been made in front of this commission before today with other witnesses. They feared retribution. That is a human behavior. It is not unique to Eskom. That is how people behave. If they feel retribution, they do not come forward. That is how we felt at that time, and I accept that. And legal opinion supported that view. But if we were wrong, I accept we were wrong.
Sorry, Mr. Linnell, the fear of retribution was definitely not made in relation to the executives we are talking about.
I would differ. That's definitely the risk.
No, no, you are giving the Commission a general view. The Commission has to deal with the facts. There was no allegation that we feared retribution from these executives.
Well, I don't know, Mr. Chairman. What I do know is in the briefing documents, I placed one incident in respect of each of the three people, which indicated there might be a propensity to interfere with an investigation. They would be, if we followed the aid memoir, those individuals would have been asked whether there was any validity in those allegations. And if they weren't valid and they were disputed, then I would agree with you. That tends to weaken that argument. But from my perspective, they were written and that is part of the record.
Well, the executives have submitted affidavits to this commission, have said none of that was put to them. The board members who came before the commission as well haven't said to the commission, we put that to the executives. So that's not the evidence before this commission, that there were fears of retribution or that there would be interference with the inquiry.
From my perspective, with respect, Mr. Chairman, is in the documents that I prepared and the argument I prepared for the board included that very purposely. And if the board chose to do something else, from my perspective, they may well have been wrong. From my perspective, I thought that was the right thing to do, and I sought opinion on that.
Yeah, we understand that. That's from a theoretical point of view. Factual point of view is something else. But you see, the commission deals with these facts Mr. Linnell, that there was a meeting even before the 11th of March. The meeting, one of which you attended, that the executives must be suspended. You were not given reasons for those suspensions. You said before the commission, you thought if you investigate those areas, you will have to remove those executives. There was a meeting, we understand. You want to comment on that? There was a meeting we undertook at Melrose Arch where the 4 executives were discussed.
Yeah, that obviously I was not aware of. I'm aware of the meetings on the 6th and the 8th and then the 11th.
Yes. So there seems to be a preconception, a preconceived idea that the executives must be suspended. And they go about to clear that reasoning with the concepts of legalities. And they get you to do it.
I would argue that the evidence of Ms. Daniel, which I heard on your commission hearings, about the meeting, I think it was on the 10th, which she was told by one of the Gupta associates that this was going to happen. That in itself did not resonate with me as being particularly logical in its content. Because if that was the case and these Gupta people knew in advance and had planned in the weeks before the 6th, that they intended to suspend these 4 people, why on earth would the Guptas on the 10th be calling in one of the employees and saying, how do we do this? That does not make sense. Something happened there, but it is not as we think it is. The board started off on the 9th as being hostile to the whole process. They demanded a meeting with the minister on the 11th, at which she convinced them that this was necessary. At the meeting of the suspensions on the 11th, the board was not ad idem at the beginning as to the suspensions.
Yeah.
If that was all convoluted beforehand,
But-
I would have expected everyone to have towed the line straight away.
Yes, but that doesn't address the point, Mr. Linnell. It doesn't address the point. The point is this: when the suspensions were muted to you, you were not given grounds why these people should be suspended. You say to the chairperson, I considered that the people in these areas should be suspended. You considered that. You then sold the idea to those you were meeting with, that this is the people, if you investigate these areas, these are the people to be suspended.
That is quite right. And,
Yes.
and the context of that is on the first day when we discussed the need, that's on the 6th and the 8th, to have an unfettered investigation. It is my firm belief that the main actors need to be removed during the period of that investigation. Otherwise, it will fail.
Yeah.
So that is a principled decision I took. The process of doing it was in the process of defining the approach to the pre-suspension discussions, which I formulated what was fair process. But that is a process, the principle I bought into on the 6th and 8th, that if you're going to do this properly, do it properly. Those people needed to be, or the right people needed to be removed. What happened on the 11th, or the 12th when they were spoken to, that was a process. And if you're going to do the process properly, you must follow the legal process, which I proposed and is documented. But I'm not trying to say that I did not want the suspensions to happen on the 6th and 8th. That would have been something I would have been quite convinced would be the appropriate thing.
Yes.
Who was to be suspended, I did not have a view.
No, we understand that. The thing is, there is no factual basis, and this is what we are testing with you. There was no factual basis to effect the suspensions. You worked on the basis of what you say, it's a principle in life. People influence the inquiry or intimidate others, but that was not the case here.
I'm afraid I have to disagree, Mr. Chairman. The issue of whether it is prudent or not to suspend senior executives is possibly that of someone who has got independent skills to come and discuss that with you and provide an opinion. My opinion at that time was that would definitely have led to an inhibition and a failure of the inquiry.
Okay.
If that is wrong, then the best person to come and tell you is someone who would know better than that.
Yes, no, that's all right. That was your opinion, Mr. Linnell. Can we move on that basis? So, because you have indicated then that the board engages with you in the days following, the 11th of March.
That's correct.
I could expedite that.
I think he gave a summary of what happened
Yes.
for the week after the 11th of March.
Yes.
And I think he should now tell us about what happened between the end of that week, after the 11th of March, up to the time when he understood that he was no longer needed.
Yes.
Do you want to tell me about that, Mr. Linnell?
Mr. Chairman, starting from the 15th, which was a Sunday, prior to that, as I've mentioned, I was invited to certain committee meetings, which were subsequently cancelled. But on the 15th, which was a Sunday, I was asked to provide input into the terms of reference from Ms. Mabunde via, I think it was the company secretary or one of the, I think it was Leo or Theo in Eskom. I provided input to that as a first draft. I then, for the following 3 days, the 16th, 17th, and 18th, continued to develop the terms of reference. During that period of time, included with invitations to the various committees, these terms of references were circulated to members of the committee. Until we got to the early morning on the 18th, when I did my final draft of the terms of reference, which are before the committee. Those terms of reference were objected to by Ms. Mabunde, and on the night of the 18th, I met with Mr. Tsutsi and Ms. Mabunde to discuss those. And at that meeting, she said to me, the committee does not want this. And we had an adversarial conversation because I said, well, what is wrong with these that she does not want these terms of reference and its associated immediate release? She could offer no reason other than at the end of that meeting, she said, well, you can appear before the committee tomorrow and argue that yourself. We left the meeting on that basis. The next morning, my invitation to that meeting was then cancelled. It was reinstituted, I think, for the 23rd and cancelled again. I never had any more engagement beyond that. So I was engaged with drafting the media statement on the 18th and the terms of reference on the 18th. And from that moment, my services were discontinued.
So,
What is your... Were you told, either verbally or by way of an email or letter, that your services would no longer be needed, or did you infer that your services were not needed once meetings to which you had been, or invitations to meetings that had been extended to you were withdrawn?
Yeah, quite right, Mr. Chairman. I think it was on the morning of the 17th following the 16th. The document is there at about 5 o'clock a.m. Before 5 o'clock a.m. I received an official email from, I think, the company secretary saying, and we can refer to the document here, saying your services are no longer required at this. The Audit and Risk Committee no longer need you in respect of the inquiry, full stop, and it's in consequence you are not required to attend the Build and Recovery meeting. So ordinarily one would have said, well, I'm no longer required to assist in this inquiry. However, at that time I was disinclined to accept that as termination of what I believed I'd been asked to do. So I discussed that with Mr. Tsotsi by way of informing him, and I continued. So on the 17th and the morning of the 18th, I continued to develop the terms of reference for the inquiry. And that is why on the 18th, I've sent Ms. Mabunde the final draft, and I met her on that evening of the 18th to discuss that final draft. So I don't know if I covered that adequately.
Yes.
You're right, Mr. Chairman. There was an email I received the morning of the 16th or the morning of the 17th. And do you wish me to continue on that?
Well, I wanted to ask whether, having regard to everything that happened, you are able to put your finger on why your services were no longer needed, or is that something you can't put your finger on?
Yes, objectively and one subjectively. So on the information I was given at the time, I think it was on the night of the 16th, it might have been a Monday, I was told that an informal gathering of board members and some of the suspended executives had taken place during the evening of that, I think it was the evening of the 16th, at which they were discussing the inquiry and whatever. It was immediately following that information I received that I received the email of the 17th, early hours of the morning, saying you are no longer required further by this committee for the inquiry. So the information I had before I got the email indicated or corroborated the email I subsequently got. That was the one point. The second point is, in my engagements directly with Ms. Mabunde on the terms of reference on the evening of the 18th, it was quite clear that she, and I think representing the views of the Audit and Risk Committee, did not like my terms of reference. And it was for that reason I was eliminated. At the same time, Mr. Chairman, they were circulating an internal alternative terms of reference, which was probably a third of the scope, and, for example, excluded important things, like in my terms of reference, as the documents will show, I'd recommended a retired judge to act as a role of almost overseer to ensure that there was no bias in the inquiry. Now, that is one specific issue that Ms. Mabunde and I think Mrs. Brown specifically objected to. I heard that from Mr. Tsotsi and from another, I think, might have been certainly Mrs. Mabunde. So whether it was just that they did not want a former judge to be an independent overseer who would make sure that there was no cover-up and it was transparent, they certainly opposed that. but I think they opposed the whole depth of the inquiry. And
Yes.
certainly the succeeding terms of reference for the
Yes. I'm going to take you back to the meeting of the 11th. Mr. Tsotsi gave evidence to the effect that, and I hope my recollection is correct, that Dr. Ngubane said that it was the Minister Lynn Brown, who said the financial director should be included among the executives to be suspended. Do you have any recollection of hearing Dr. Ngubane say that at either the P&G meeting or the board meeting that came after the meeting between the board and the minister?
Mr. Chairman, I don't recollect that. What I recollect is there was a lot of interplay between all the directors, whether it's 3 or 4 and was the FD part of it or not. But I don't remember anyone saying, whether it was Dr. Ngogani or anyone else, that the minister had said anything at all. That doesn't, I might have missed it.
Yes.
But I did not hear that.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Tsotsi also said he was told when he raised the issue of, or when he expressed his surprise that the P&G meeting was discussing names of people who were going to act in the positions of the executives, when he expressed his surprise that the committee members were discussing these names in circumstances where they didn't know these people. I think he said somebody, either Dr. Ngubane or maybe somebody else, said the names came from the minister, Minister Lynn Brown. Do you recall ever hearing anybody, whether it was Dr. Ngubane or somebody else, saying that these names of people who were going to act in the positions of the executives came from the minister?
Mr. Chairman, I don't recollect any of that discussion, whether it was mentioned that the names came from the minister. I don't remember anyone. I don't think I was present when they discussed the names of the replacements.
Okay.
The minutes might reflect that I was there, but I have no recollection of being in that meeting at all. So
Yes.
I wouldn't have heard that. But presumably the minister would have said that in meeting on the 11th.
Yes. Okay, all right. Mr. Select.
I wasn't there.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Linnell, there's also a version put in one of the affidavits, if not 2 affidavits, that the names of the acting people came from the presidency. Would you know anything about that?
I've never heard that. I've never heard that at all before today.
Let's go back to...
Sorry, can I comment?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Mr. Chair? When I say I cannot recall that, that certainly was not mentioned in the meeting on the 8th. Definitely not. It might have been mentioned subsequently in another meeting, but on the 8th in Durban, that did not come up at all.
No, it would not have come up in Durban because the names of acting people, as far as I recall, were not discussed at the Durban meeting, isn't it?
That's correct.
Yeah.
They were not mentioned.
Thank you, Mr. Linnell. Going back to the time when you are told that you are no longer needed, you gave the chairpersons what you think were the reasons why you were no longer needed. One of those is that you learned of a meeting that took place in the evening of 16th of March 2015. And I'm going to help you with the page reference to your affidavit is page 36. And as you go there...
Black 36.
That's correct, yes. Page 36, paragraph 42 and 44. In paragraph 42, you relate about the email you received on the 17th of March, which tells you that you were no longer needed. Well, it says you are no longer required to attend the meeting. And then in paragraph 44, you say, upon making some inquiries concerning this abrupt change of events, I received information that a number of members of the board and some of the suspended executives had attended a late night private meeting during the night of Monday 16th. I assume that this was linked to the early morning email cancelling my appointment. You see that?
I do.
Yeah. Are you able, please, to relate to the chairperson? Who would you have made inquiries with, as you state in paragraph 44?
I think, as I mentioned before, on reflection, I don't think I made deliberate inquiries. I was informed of the meeting, and I've got a feeling I was informed of the meeting during its course. In other words, it would have been on the 16th. So, whereas here I say upon making inquiries, I think that's actually in reverse order. I think, as I recollect, it would have been on the 16th. I would have been told that there was a meeting in progress at a house at which certain board members, certain suspended executives, and with respect, the minister being present. That was the purport of that information I received. Then the next morning I got the email, and so where I say here I got the email at 4:50 a.m. and then made inquiries. I think the information I got was before the email, and then I drew reference to the email back to what I'd heard the evening before. So my sequence is up, but without doubt I was given information that there was a meeting.
We are at 1 minute to 1 on my watch. My position is that unless there is something else that has escaped my mind, Mr. Linnell has covered most of the things that I consider important. But if there is one or two questions you still wanted to ask him, feel free to do so. But I would like that after lunch we go to the next witness. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I can do so quickly with Mr. Linnell. Okay, Mr. Linnell, thank you for clarifying the order there. You said the minister was also present in that meeting of the 16th of March.
That was information I got as part and parcel of who was at that meeting.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because I think it might have been Jabu, because I remember thinking, how would anyone know who's having a meeting? It was quite strange information to receive. So I don't know if factually a meeting took place, but it certainly appeared to be linked to the early hours of the morning email. So the gentleman who sent me the email ought to be able to tell the commission who instructed him to send that email at 4:50 a.m. on the 17th, because that would verify why this happened.
Yeah. So when you refer to Jabu, are you talking about Jabu Maswanganyi?
I think it would have been him. But if he denied it, I'm not going to say it was him, but I think it might have been him who informed me of that meeting.
Sorry? If not him,
relying on Mr. Tsotsi because I didn't know anyone else who could tell me that in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
You know, early hours.
Yes, you will recall that you mentioned in your affidavit that you wrote a letter for Mr. Tsotsi to address to the minister.
Correct.
And in that letter, this statement is also made, that there was a secret meeting on the 16th of March 2015, where some board members met with some suspended executives. So is it you or is it Mr. Tsotsi who knew about this meeting?
I drafted that letter and I put that in because that was my information, and he would have agreed to that information because he signed the letter. So I drafted that letter, I think with some input from Jabu,
Yes.
as a subsequent round. So the letter to the minister, the purport of that was to complain to the minister that these behaviors of the board were continuing behind Mr. Tsotsi's back, and the allegation at the bottom of that letter is this was in order to prevent the inquiry going ahead.
Yes.
So it was a very specific letter.
Just quickly, can you tell the chairperson whether you know which the board members were said to have convened this meeting and which some suspended executives?
I never heard that, no, Mr. Chairman.
You were not given the names?
No.
Yeah, isn't that strange? But they said the minister, they said the minister was also present in that meeting.
And therefore the inclusion of that in the letter to her would have been quite telling. It was, in a sense, it was deliberate.
Because of your information that she was also present at that meeting.
Well, it does convey to her that Mr. Tsotsi knows about a meeting, and if in fact she was present at that meeting, she would know that he knows there was a meeting.
I see. I think, Chair, that concludes my questions.
With respect,
Yes.
Yeah, could I-
Mr. Linnell, is there something you would like to say?
in 1 minute.
Yes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With regard to my role, if I could encapsulate that, from my perspective, I was asked to coordinate an inquiry. I believe that inquiry was very necessary and urgent, critical to the country. I prepared documents including the terms of reference for that inquiry, media briefings. I put together things which would ensure that that inquiry would be transparent and independent and comprehensive. And as a result of that, I ended up with an impasse with the board, and that led to my removal. So it is my view that the brief originally given to me, I sought to fulfill completely. And even after that, I continued, in a sense, to oppose not so much my removal, but the termination of the inquiry. As you would know in the bundle, a letter was also sent to the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee complaining about the same thing and making the same allegation that the board was thwarting the inquiry as scoped in the terms of reference. So the minister was told that the board was frustrating this very expressly, and the chairman of the Portfolio Committee was told that expressly, and Ms. Mbunda and the committee would have known that they were opposing that. And that was the end of my dealings with them.
Yes, no, that's fine. Just one point, we spoke in relation to SAA about whether you were being brought into these SOEs to do a job in respect of which they had capacities. I have had evidence that, for example, you talk about media releases that you drafted. I have had evidence that Eskom had a communications department which used to prepare media statements for the chairperson. I think I've had evidence about also there being a head of the legal department at Eskom. But I'm just mentioning that we have had a discussion about it. So I'll look at it and bear in mind what you said, and it would seem that the role you were also playing wasn't necessarily strictly a role that related to giving legal advices. Is that correct? Seems to have been some role. Maybe the fact that you had a legal background was useful, but there must have been a reason why you would bring in lawyers when you had the legal background. Is my understanding more or less correct? That your role...
For the suspensions or the media release?
Yeah, yes.
The suspensions or the media?
No, what I'm saying is, it seems that your role wasn't one that necessarily depended upon or required essentially legal knowledge. And I'm saying that maybe that's why we see you bringing in lawyers sometimes to assist. And then we see you drafting media statements. Something that the communications department at Eskom would normally do. So it seems to me that your role wasn't necessarily a role to provide legal services. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, you're absolutely right. You're correct, Mr. Chairman. I was not retained at all to provide any legal opinion or advice. That was not the purpose. It was preparatory to doing the setup of the inquiry that required some legal knowledge, but I sought independent legal advice on legal issues. But my main role was putting together the terms of reference in the media statement and canvassing entities to do the functions referred to in the terms of reference. So my role was purely a business coordination role. I was putting together the wherewithal to conduct an inquiry. It was not a legal role at all. And I think we did mention that the board and the minister refused to allow the media release to be released to the press. And the benefit of that would have been that would have cast in stone how the inquiry subsequently would have rolled out, because it set out very clearly that it would be independent, that there would be a judge, that there would be independent people, and that is what was quashed.
Now, to the extent...
I drafted that, not the internal communications department.
To the extent that you say your role was not that of providing legal services, what qualifications did you have, formal qualifications, to provide that non-legal service? We know you had law degrees. We know you had law degrees. We know you had been an attorney in Zimbabwe. We know you had been a magistrate from. So if one said this somebody is going to provide legal services, one can understand from that point of view, minus the fact that one doesn't know how much familiar you may have been with South African law, but you may have been familiar with it. But if we leave aside legal qualifications because those might be useful for legal services, what formal qualifications did you have to provide the non-legal role to play the non-legal role that you were playing?
I have an honours Bachelor of Commerce degree from the University of Cape Town. That is in technology. I worked for 20 years in large corporates in South Africa, all the way through to board level. I operated in a consultancy company which provided similar legal consulting services to many, many corporates in South Africa over a period of 20 years. So if you exclude the legal background I had altogether, I've had 20 years extensive corporate South African business experience and almost 10 or more years, 15 years of consulting experience within the South African business environment. And so I've done many, many documents of terms of references, scoping of contracts, inquiries, projects, implementations of technology solutions, insurance company turns around, medical schemes. I've been there for 15 to 20 years doing that. This is what I do, which I would have been engaged to do in Eskom. Writing of this terms of reference and the media statement would have been something I was very experienced in doing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Linnell. Thank you for availing yourself to assist the Commission to throw more light as to what happened or what led to the inquiry that took place at Eskom and the suspensions of the executives and the role that you played up to the time when you were told you were no longer required for the meetings.
Mr. Chairman, may I
yes.
make one final comment? Is it
Yes.
acceptable?
Yes, you may.
Mr. Chairman, at the time we did the suspensions, in no one's mind was it ever contemplated that these people would not return to work in the way they did not. So what followed, no one, neither the press nor ourselves, it was never evident that what transpired was contemplated in any event. And whether it was considered by anyone at that stage is debatable. It might have, but certainly we did not have any understanding that what transpired was contemplated at all.
Well,
and that I made clear in my statement,
yes,
where I identify the subsequent termination as being suspicious in relation to the terms of their suspension. I draw reference to that in my affidavit.
Well, I will see evidence. I'll see when all the evidence is in, but there is a possibility that there was someone or there were people outside of Eskom who were making certain decisions or influencing certain decisions that were being taken at Eskom, including the decision to suspend these executives. We will see when all the evidence is in. I did hear evidence, for example, that when Dr. Ngubane was either acting chairperson or chairperson, that is later than this time, somebody from outside of Eskom sent him a document reflecting what resolution the board should take in regard to certain newspapers, and Dr. Ngubane took that document to the board, and it seems the board endorsed those decisions that were sought, it seems, by somebody outside of Eskom. But we will hear more evidence, and one will hopefully get a clearer picture as we hear more evidence. But thank you very much, Mr. Linnell, for availing yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We are going to take, so you are excused, Mr. Linnell. We are going to take the lunch adjournment. It's 1:15. We'll resume at 2:15.
Thank you, Chair.
We adjourn.